The North British Locomotive Company was the principal manufacturer of steam locomotives in the UK from their inception in 1903 right up until the end of steam. Given the fact that it was the British that first invented the steam engine, it's not a surprise to know that the North British Locomotive Company was astonishingly successful in this particular task. They knew what they were doing, and if you were a railway that purchased a steam locomotive from North British, you could be assured that whatever you received was top tier. But the North British Locomotive Company is no longer around. Why is that? Well, spoiler warning, it's pretty much the same reason why the steam manufacturers in America aren't around anymore. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains British. Yay. And today, we're going to discuss the North British Locomotive Company. And carrying on with the trend of my videos about actual locomotive manufacturers being incredibly successful, I decided to jump over the pond and discuss, well, the British. This is the story and the collapse of the North British Locomotive Company. The North British Locomotive Company, usually called NBL, which is probably what I'm going to keep saying because their full name is kind of a mouthful, was actually created in 1903, which does seem to be pretty late to the locomotive party, but that's because they were the product of a merger of three distinct Glasgow locomotive manufacturing companies: Sharp, Stewart and Company, Nielsen, Reed and Company, as well as Dubs and Company. These different manufacturers would become Atlas Works, Hyde Park Works, and Queen's Park Works respectively, all under one corporation, the North British Locomotive Company. They were, in fact, the largest locomotive manufacturing company in Europe, as well as the British Empire. From their inception, they were a dominant force in the market, but as we've established, manufacturing locomotives is kind of a limited market. There are only so many railways out there. And the thing about being a British company in this field is that it really wasn't reasonable to only focus on British companies for your sales, due to, well, space. It's true, the rail density, the number of lines that encompass a certain amount of space, was much larger than most locations, but the UK itself is not a very large country, especially when compared to something like America. And while American companies like Baldwin could get away with only selling to mostly American companies, North British had to think outside the box and focused a lot more on the export market. They definitely did make locomotives for the UK, but in order to increase sales, they made a ton of locomotives for just so many other countries. Now, seriously, going over a list of the number of countries that purchased from the North British Locomotive Company is kind of like listening to Yakko tell you the names of all the countries in the world. Like, seriously, it's just a geography lesson. They sold locomotives to Canada, Argentina, Paraguay, France, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Turkey, Angola, Gold Coast, which is now Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, South Africa, Egypt, Palestine, India, Cayman, which is now Sri Lanka, China, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, as well as Australia, and of course, New Zealand. They were all over the world. Pretty much the only countries that didn't buy from them were countries with a very large industrial complex, like Russia, or the Soviet Union, Germany, and of course, USA! But it was very lucrative for the North British Locomotive Company to do this because they expanded their own market. They weren't just stuck on the islands of the United Kingdom, they were a global manufacturer that could in fact export quality steam locomotives all over the place, and yes, their steam locomotives were of excellent quality. Just like any locomotive manufacturer, some of the designs they made didn't necessarily develop themselves. They were developed for the railways and they were built under contract, but they did, of course, build their own on occasion to sell to railways that weren't really sure how to build a locomotive on their own, so they just asked North British to do it. And they did. To go over a whole list of the locomotives that are credited with North British would be kind of a long video, like really long, but they worked on locomotives like the Stanier 8Fs, the Royal Scots, Jubilees, the War Department austerities, Prince of Wales class, the list goes on. Their steam locomotives were good, genuinely so, and railways knew that, which is why so many countries bought from them, even countries that weren't actually under British control, like they weren't colonies, they were their own countries, and yet they still went to North British because they knew that NBL would deliver them a quality product. And it lasted that way for years, even through things like the Great Depression as well as World War II. North British kept pumping out locomotives like crazy. As I mentioned, they were responsible for some War Department locomotives, and they actually built the first prototype of the Anglo-American Mark 8 battlefield tank for the Allied armies. That was in 1918 for World War I, though that tank never actually entered production as the war ended before that could happen. But the point is, they didn't just do locomotives, but that was obviously their bread and butter. I mean, they were named for it. That's what they were for. That's what they did. That's what they continued doing for a long time. Right up until... you. Now, to say that NBL's fall would necessarily be British Rail's fault is actually massively unfair. What British Rail was doing on their own was probably what they needed to do, even if they didn't do it correctly, and of course I'm talking about the modernization plan. See, just like every other steam locomotive manufacturer I've talked about so far, what their major undoing, well, it involved diesels, or rather the inability to either market or produce quality diesels. When the UK nationalised their entire rail system, it wasn't so much that British Railways wasn't buying steam engines. They would continue to do so for a few more years. But the modernization plan kind of came out of left field, and the problem for North British is that, well, a lot of British manufacturers had the issue of not really dabbling that much into diesels, like, at all. The notion that they would ever stop making steam engines, given they're the country that invented them, just didn't seem to occur to a lot of the builders. Though they did dabble for a bit, they were responsible for a Paxman engine diesel locomotive, the British Rail 10800, commonly known as the Wonder engine. Not because it was actually good, but because the crews often remarked, "I wonder if it will go today," because it basically didn't work, ever. So that wasn't really a good start. That was prior to British Railways, so it wasn't as though NBL didn't know diesels existed, they just weren't that good at them, and didn't really try very hard to get better at them. Although it's worth mentioning, the 10800 actually wasn't even delivered till after British Railways was a thing, so it's one of those weird cases. They also built CGR Class G2 for Ceylon government railways, and they weren't that good either. There's actually very little information about them. They also built the PVH-1 in 1953, known as the Paxman Voith Hydraulic 1, for the Emu Bay Railway in Tasmania. That locomotive is actually preserved. Then they built 8 Paxman-ented shunters, which are known as British Rail Class D2/1s. They weren't very good, and they were all withdrawn between 1963 and 1968. And when it came time to actually build full-size diesels, like for more than just yard work, oh no. North British knew they had a problem on their hands, because, yeah, the modernization plan was coming. Things were changing, and they would have to change with it if they were going to survive. People weren't buying steam locomotives anymore, they wanted the diesels, and they had to figure out how to make them. So, did they do that? Well, sort of. They at least gave it an honest try. And by that I mean they signed a deal with a German company, MAN, and they wanted to construct their diesel engines under license. This was agreed upon, and as a result, those new power units began appearing in the late 1950s NBL designs, such as the British Rail Class D3/1, which were also shunters and weren't very good. And when it came to a full-size mainline diesel, oh, goodness. Well, let's see. Let's start with the Class 21. They caught fire. No, seriously, it almost killed one of the drivers one time, and they were so unusable that British Rail literally just stuck them in their shed and stopped using them because they could literally kill anyone at any waking moment. So that wasn't good. There were the Class 22s, which weren't as murderous, but had serious teething problems, and by the time they got them sorted, they were so underpowered compared to a lot of the other diesels that it wasn't worth it anymore. There were the Class 41s, which admittedly were probably the best ones that NBL was responsible for. Rumors of unreliability encircle most of their diesels, but in the 41's case, that doesn't seem to be quite true. They actually worked. The reason why they were withdrawn is they ultimately became non-standard, as the other thing NBL was consistently doing was they were working with diesel hydraulic designs, but British Rail eventually would focus on diesel electric, not hydraulic. And then there were the Class 43s, which are hysterical, because they are nearly identical to the Swindon Works built Class 42s. And in fact, they had the same basis. the German V200 diesels. Except that while Swindon managed to handle theirs pretty much okay, like they weren't as good as the German originals, but they were still serviceable, NBL totally screwed theirs up. They were less reliable for so many reasons. For one thing, mild steel was used for the exhaust manifolds, and those components were prone to fracture, which resulted in a loss of exhaust pressure to drive the turbochargers, but it also caused the driving cabs to fill with exhaust fumes. So again, we have another diesel design that was possibly going to murder somebody. Excellent, excellent. They also probably rated their engine design far too high given its components, as it had no active piston cooling, and piston ring life expectancy was decreased as a result. Also, they screwed up their measurements. See, at the time, NBL still used imperial, like we do here in America, feet and inches. But MAN, over in Germany, used the metric system. When they sent the plans over for NBL to utilize, they completely screwed up the conversions. There were tons of rounding errors all over the place, and that caused many components not to fit well together or be slightly off in many places. If you ask any designer of anything, an engineer for building, for engines, whatever, decimal points are important. Very important. If you screw that up, the final product is liable to fall apart. And that was pretty much the case with the 43s. They weren't going to work. They managed to last through the 60s, as when they were working they were still fairly powerful, but the deficiencies were clear, and NBL had more egg on their face. Did they only focus on diesels? What about electric units? Maybe they could do those. And yeah, they actually did. See, in the early 1950s, the General Electric Company, no, not GE, GEC, they're a British General Electric, actually won a contract to build 40 electric locomotives for the South African railways. They would become known as SAR Class 4Es, but they subcontracted the job out to NBL. Now, those locomotives turned out okay. They did have some trouble with their bogies, but their actual inner workings were alright, but that was probably because NBL was pretty much only tasked with putting them together. The electrical components were supplied by the General Electric Company, so they didn't have to worry about that. And the companies had a pretty close working relationship. GEC and NBL cooperated again in the construction of some early 25 kilovolt AC electric locomotives for the West Coast Main Line, the Class AL4, which become known as British Rail's Class 84s. But these sucked. They had poor reliability for a variety of reasons, and spent long periods out of service. They had rough riding, flashovers in the transformer windings, short lifespans of the motor spring drives, as well as major problems with their mercury arc rectifiers. They were terrible, and it was just further evidence that the North British Locomotive Company didn't know how to make anything that wasn't a steam engine. They really didn't know how to handle diesels or electrics that well. Even with assistance, they kept screwing it up. And that was a problem because their management style wasn't very good either in terms of selling their locomotives. See, while I have historically given British Rail a lot of slack for spending so much money on so many different types of locomotives, they were admittedly trying to figure out what worked. And the thing about the North British Locomotive Company is they were actually selling their locomotives to them at a financial loss. Now, why in the heck would they want to do that? They kind of had to make money to keep existing, but it seems like their success over the years when it came to locomotive manufacture may have gone over their heads. They assumed they'd be able to handle the task of building diesels and electrics, and thus they planned on making more money from future orders for more of their super amazing locomotives that definitely worked, except that none of them did, and no future orders came. And therefore, they never made any money on it. They were hemorrhaging it like crazy. Every time they built a new design, they always did it again. They bid low, expecting they'd be able to make up more money in the future when they gave them a successful design. But none of the designs were successful, or at best they wound up being non-standard, and the point was that British Railways just didn't pay them anymore. Because why would they? And the other problem with delivering an inferior product consistently, and even over a very small period of time, is that there are things that we like to call warranties. NBL did good, honest business, and offered free repair on many of their designs in the contracts. And that was a problem, because with the designs so horribly screwed up, it meant that much of their time was being wasted fixing the problems they caused for free. And the more they supplied bad locomotives, the more their customers, well, didn't want to use them, even British Railways. They even had a requirement that all locomotives would be sourced from British manufacturers, which admittedly is actually a good idea, at least on paper, because it keeps the British money in Britain. Which, yeah, that's good for home industries. But the problem is that, at least in NBL's case, They didn't know how to do what British Rail wanted them to do, and weren't willing to admit that they didn't, or take the necessary steps a lot sooner to actually figure it out, and instead assume that they could survive with their steam engines. And remember, NBL was the largest manufacturer of locomotives, not just in the UK, but in Europe, and the transition to diesels killed them in less than a decade. In 1959, the General Electric Company, Clydesdale Bank, as well as the HM Treasury tried to save the floundering North British Locomotive Company by investing in a restructuring program that would enable them to actually, build diesels properly. It was during that restructuring program that they built many of their diesels, and many of them were failures, like we already established. It did not work. They finally called it quits on the 19th of April, 1962. They entered voluntary liquidation, not believing there was any way forward for them, and it was probably the most honest thing they could have done. They just didn't know how to make diesels. They had to admit that, and they didn't have enough money to stay afloat anymore. And as far as the future of their work sites, well, Atlas Works is now an industrial estate. Hyde Park Works is now the campus of North Glasgow College, and Queen's Park Works has now been given over to a variety of different industrial and commercial uses. In terms of the actual infrastructure, they built many British locomotives. For many years, it's pretty much gone. But that's not the end of the story, at least not completely. It's true, the company is long gone, but their products are still here. Remember, we are talking about the largest locomotive manufacturer in Europe, with products that were sold and exported pretty much worldwide. Many of their steam locomotives in particular are preserved not just in the UK, but in many other countries that utilized them, because they were well loved, because they were genuinely good, because when it came to steam, there were few that were on par with the North British Locomotive Company. It's just funny to think that you could travel to places like South Africa, Israel, China, Australia, Japan, Malaysia, to see the fruits of the labors of NBL. And for that, many rail fans, especially in the UK, will always remember them. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitchen 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Rare Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Razor 78, Lord Ha 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, that guy with a beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Murder Drones Doll, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, and Isofer 1405. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.